It's Plato's Republic, Summer 2021, Session 1, Justice in the State and Person. All right, so yeah, so most of you have done the introduction. That's great, and it's great to have you guys back. You probably don't realize it, but you have learned a little bit, even though maybe some of it you've forgotten. At least you have some idea when someone says the theory of forms, Plato's theory of forms, you know a bit about what that's about. You know that the opposites are important. You know that every idea, everything has its other side. You know that stuff about island and sea, and the island must have its sea in order to be an island. And you know that the forms, whatever that means, you know, are insensible, eternal, and they're immediately known. So we're moving away from this kind of like the reality that we're knowing is external and material and unknown. So yeah, and you know, like we were giving the kind of the best examples, the way to kind of get into Plato's understanding is through things like the ideal circle, and that every particular circle participates in this ideal. And then also about numbers, that numbers in themselves are actually imperceptible, very much ideal and eternal in this formal sense. And they're expressed by particular things, or as Plato says, they are participated by things. So two things participates the form of two. So, and then this as a contrast to the other way of viewing, perhaps a way that is more familiar to us in modern times, which we've portrayed as Aristotelian, you know, with Plato pointing up or pointing in and Aristotle pointing down to finding the being of particular being of things in their particularity, in their material existence. And also that Aristotle tends to use as his primary method, his organon, as he calls it, logic. Whereas for Plato, what's elementary is mathematics and mathematical forms. So don't really worry too much if you haven't recorded all this, or you don't have it all, you know, like completely clear. That's okay, because when you do these courses, we'll come back to these things again and again from different angles. And in that way, you'll get more familiar with Plato. But having said that, this Republic, what you've embarked on here is a big book. It's actually 10 books, and it can be tough going at times. We're not going to read it all, but I hope we'll be able to give you a taste of it, a taste of this book, a taste of what is a foundational work in the entire European tradition. So it's a very important work which goes way beyond, you know, actual Platonism, as I'll refer to as we move on. Okay, so I think I've asked everyone who's arrived whether they got the book, and we know Bula hasn't. And everyone's got the reading, the bookmarks, or you can find the reading on the course outline on the website. If you lose your bookmark or you just need to find it, go to the course outline for the Republic, and you'll find the reading. We changed the reading.
Sorry, Benny, can I just jump in, and I'm going to let everyone know that if you don't know where the course outline is, or if you'd like to access these recordings that we're making later, you can look in the chat and there's a link to the resources page. And just so you know that this is going to be uploaded to YouTube unlisted, so only people with the link can see it, which will be only the people in this class.
Okay, thanks, David. Yeah, so we're trying to make the resources page the kind of gateway to all the information for this particular class. So just this class has its own page. Yeah. So yeah, with the readings, I think I've said this before, that the translations don't really matter. I mean, I actually, as a teacher, prefer to have people have different translations, although some people prefer to have the one that most of us are reading because it's just a little bit more comfortable, but I like you to be a little bit uncomfortable. So there's actually two in Penguin, which is confusing, and that's the same with reading Plato. And so there's one more recent one by Christopher Rowe, which some people get, and then the one that we send a link to and we bought in bulk is the older translation by Lee with an introduction by Melissa Lane. It has on the front cover. So this is an older version of it, which you might have seen around in secondhand bookshops. It's one I've had for a long time, and of course there's so many others. You know, now the main thing, of course, is if you are getting a translation, you know, you choose which one you prefer, but it does help when you're studying it to have the standard page numbers down the side. The Christopher Rowe version, I think the same in The Last Days of Socrates, doesn't have the little sections, divisions with a little summary at the top. So as beginners, some people find that really handy. That's in this and this. Yeah, so some people find that handy just to get orientation. And do notice that I don't know who else does this, but certainly Penguin divides into parts rather than books, because the book division is sometimes doesn't make sense. It just divides in the middle of a discussion. So there are parts there. So when I'm referring to books, do make sure that you look often at the top of the page. It will tell you, I don't know if you can see that, it'll tell you exactly which book. In brackets, in reverse, it says, what's that say, book 3. So yeah, so there's parts and books. So that's all a little confusing. I'm going to stick to saying books just because I don't expect everyone to have to have that version. And Nick's arrived.
Hi Bernie.
Good
Hi,
to see you, Nick.
Sorry,
No, that's fine. We haven't. I have started, but I haven't really said anything that you can't catch up on. In fact, why don't I put you on the spot?
Oh.
Because maybe it's a good time now to just go around the room to introduce ourselves, because some of us know each other, but some are from different groups. So maybe just give your name and what's drawn you to Plato's Republic. Why do you want to have a go at reading Plato's Republic?
I think because Maria just wouldn't shut up about it. She just kept on talking about how wonderful the class was. So, well, my name's Nick. I'm from Sydney. I've done 2, I think, other classes with Bernie and enjoyed them all thoroughly. So I thought that I should just continue. I've always wanted to sort of read Plato, and this is the impetus to do it.
Oh, that's great, Nick. And so you did Platonic Love as well, did you?
No, I did the introduction to the symposium and
the symposium and the Phaedrus.
Yes, and then we did
Plato and Christianity.
Plato and Christianity. That's right.
Oh, so you've done 3.
No, I've done 2. This is my 3rd.
Okay, yeah. All right. Okay. Vula, do you want to go next, and then Dimitra?
Hi everyone, Vula Giannopoulos is my name. I'm in Adelaide, and I've done 3 other courses with Bernie, enjoyed them thoroughly, and have been hanging out to do the Republic because arguably it's sort of the most discussed one about Plato, so I look forward to this.
Thanks very much, Vula. And Dimitra?
Hi, I'm in Melbourne and I'm following on after having done the introductory sessions with Bernie as well. And my warmth towards Plato started in my ancient Greek classes when I was a teenager, and the know thyself thing has always intrigued me. So I'm absolutely delighted to be following this after many, many years.
Oh, thanks, Demetra. Oh, I didn't warn anyone. Oh, Kathy's here. Kathy V, can we call you Kathy V? Is that okay? Because
that's
we've got,
okay.
yeah.
Hi, cousin Kathy.
Now, hang on, you guys aren't cousins or something, are you?
Yeah.
Kathy, yes, we are.
You
we
are,
didn't know
okay.
we were doing the first one. We
Okay,
didn't know we were
yeah.
getting
I think
involved.
you're actually sisters. I think someone's not
That's
telling me something.
right.
Yeah, yeah.
As we
We'll
mature, we look more alike.
That's true.
Okay, Kathy V, do you, we're just introducing ourselves and
Sure.
saying what drew you to Plato's Republic? Can I put you on the spot there?
Yeah, sure. I apologize for being late. Wednesday is going to be very tricky for me. I just think I need a little bit more of a mind stuff up. I thought I just needed to get the grey cells working a little bit more.
Okay, thanks, Kathy V.
That's okay.
And cousin Kathy, we haven't done you yet, have we?
No.
No. Okay.
No, so I've done the introductory, but my interest in philosophy and Plato started when I did my degree in physical education, and I just really enjoyed the philosophy part. And then I also had a father that was talked a lot about Plato, and as we were growing up, and even just before he died, really, about gods and things like that. So it's just always been something I've been stimulated in, and I wanted to get rid of some of that grey matter after lockdown as well.
Get rid of it. Okay.
Time to study.
Yeah. Well, I wish I had a dad talking about Plato. So that's a wonderful thing. Not everyone has a dad like that. So that's lovely.
I don't know how much I retain.
Okay. Paul, do you want to tell us why you were drawn to Plato's Republic?
Yep. Hi, everyone. I'm Paul. I studied a bit of theology in the past, but not a lot of philosophy. So I wanted to learn a bit. And I did the first introductory course, reading Plato, and really enjoyed it. So thought I'd come back for this one as well.
And it's great to see you back, Paul. And I think I've still got Eleni to go. Yes? Eleni.
Yeah, my name's Eleni, Melbourne. I stumbled across this last year during lockdown. So I did the introductory course and loved it, and then did Christianity and enjoyed that as well. And this was the third one that I've been waiting to do. So I'm very much looking forward to.
Oh, that's great.
Republic. Yeah.
And it's a bit of a smaller group than Plato and Christianity, wasn't it? Yeah, that was a bit more a lecture. If people weren't there, it was a bit more like lectures because we had a big group. And we might do that again in a big group, but these classes are much more around discussion. And I have to say, people have said this, and it almost seems like a marketing ploy for this class, because Maria and other people, and even myself, will keep saying, well, this is in the Republic, or, you know, you've got to go to the Republic, you've got to go to it. And yet we weren't teaching the Republic. So I think we'll have to get this on a short cycle, and maybe teach it every second season. We'll see how we go, because it is important and people are interested. Now, David, maybe not everyone knows David yet. David's been around quite a bit. But
hey, everyone.
Wanted to say hi.
Yeah. I'm David. I've seen some of you before, and there's some fresh faces here as well. Today I'm just filling in for Maria, who's going to be here for the rest of the course, but I've been sort of behind the scenes helping out with the academy since it started. Yeah,
so David and I founded the academy together with one other person. So and it's great to have David around. It's always reassuring for me. Okay, so there we go. That's the introduction. So today, as you can see, today is a bit different from the other times. And for those who haven't done many classes, really what we normally do is introduce. I'll give a bit of the narrative. I'm going to give you a narrative right through the whole thing, which is a bit of a challenge when it's 10 books, and then especially focus on the actual reading. So I'll give you a bit of a talk, and then some discussion, and then a bit more of a talk, and we'll go through the whole book, and then maybe you want to go back and read the whole book. But you know, the reading for this is only some small sections. So there you go. So what I'll start off with first is just a general introduction to the Republic, and I think this is really important, because to give the book some sort of context in Plato's work, especially. So the place of the Republic in Plato's work, I might jump to share screen here. So let me do that so we can have something to look at. Okay, I think that's it. Okay. Can everyone see a PowerPoint? Can anyone not see a PowerPoint slide? All right. Okay, so it's kind of important now, after you've done that introduction, to consider the context of the text we're reading in terms of Plato's work. Now, some people really emphasize this, and some people pull right back. I definitely think it is worth understanding Plato's work in terms of early, middle, and late period. So the early periods of Plato's work tend to be the Socratic dialogues, which are inconclusive at the end. So it's kind of classic Socratic dialogues, like Euthyphro, which we did in the introductory course, is very typical of an early one. Then in the middle period, you also get these Socratic dialogues, so meaning that Socrates is the main character in the little play, but they tend to be more preachy, more pushing Plato's philosophical view. So, you know, knowing is remembering, the theory, you know, the opposites and the forms, the whole forms theory, and how that all works with everything. So in the introduction, we did the Phaedo, and that's typical of middle work. And another one that some people have done here is the Symposium. So that's a middle period dialogue. In the late period, you often have Socrates, but sometimes other main characters driving the dialogue. And an example is the Parmenides, where the famous philosopher is portrayed. Parmenides is portrayed, and he's the main character there. And then the sophist, a follower of Parmenides, is the main character. And another dialogue from this period is the Timaeus, which was very famous and probably the main dialogue right through medieval Christianity. So we might do that one day as well. So where does the Republic fit in this? Well, it's a middle period dialogue. What do I say? After, perhaps written after the Phaedo. But just think of it as one of those middle periods. But it is an important middle period one, because in the Republic, it feels like, if this chronology is right, that it's the first time where you really get a good introduction to the theory of forms. You get that famous allegory of the cave and all the stuff in the allegorical section that is really important in people's understanding of Plato as it moved on into Platonism down through the next 2.5 millennia. So what's the Republic about? Well, it is, on the face of it, I might stop sharing the screen there. And it's a utopian project, an imaginary creation of a Callipolis, a beautiful city. And it is actually the first utopia. Many followed in our tradition after this. And maybe I'll just give a bit of an aside on utopia. So the term utopia comes from Thomas More, a British theologian during the Reformation, who's famous for other things, which we won't go into, but he was right into Greek. He could read Greek, and he translated, sometimes for the first time, some Greek text. So he was very much Hellenophile, and very much a part of the revival of Greek wisdom in the well, certainly in the Reformation, actually, in Renaissance Reformation. A friend of Erasmus from Rotterdam, and he wrote this book called, literally called, like Nowhere Land. Utopia is Nowhere Land. And then following that, there was another utopia, which was called New Atlantis by Francis Bacon. That was very influential also, and influential on, if you've heard of the Royal Society of London and these societies, this introduction of science into a legitimate public role, New Atlantis by Francis Bacon. And so, of course, Atlantis comes from Plato as well. So it comes from a myth in Plato's Timaeus, so if we ever do Timaeus. So Plato was very important in this idea of saying, okay, look, what is the ideal society? Let's just let our imagination go. So what are we aiming for? What are we actually aiming for? Forget so much what actually is. So there's also the subtitle on justice. Now this is most likely added later. All these subtitles, you might see them in some of the translations. They're certainly in the Lerb translations. And but this is justifiable because in the narrative, it's looking at the good and just society. What is the good and just society? And it really starts off with the question of what is justice, as we'll see today. Justice meaning the just person. And then it's writ large into the just society. So, and you also remember that justice is a theme going right through Plato, justice of the person and justice of society. And if you remember back in the second class of the introduction, where we were reading Euthyphro, where the question of what is piety came up, and then it was a form of justice. So the dialogue was moving towards the question there already of what is justice. And so the question of how justice and the good society is connected, well, what Socrates says in this dialogue, he says, we set about founding an ideal state, being sure we should find justice in it because it is good. So this is public justice, which is our modern meaning in a way. When we think of justice, we think of it in this way. So again, this is a situation like a notion of divinity and the gods and stuff, where Plato has actually influenced the way we now think about some of these categories or terms. So the Republic is a utopia. It's a utopia that's aspiring for the good life, a happy life for all. But this is not always the main interest in reading the Republic down through the ages. And perhaps for us, it won't be our main interest either. In a way, that's up to you. So it's not just interpreted as pushing this utopia. There's lots of layers of meaning, and and the discussion goes into these different levels, which seemingly have very little to do with the end goal of the just society. So sometimes readers are interested in the utopia itself, its social structure and government, etc. But often those people who are interested in that are the ones that stick the boot in. It gets a lot of criticism. You can find lots of reasons, and we will find lots of reasons, I think, not to like Plato's politics. But among Platonists, this is usually not the main interest. It is rather Plato's philosophy per se. The Republic is famous for its account of the theory of forms, famous for the allegory of the cave, where sensible things are shadows of their formal essences, famous for enlightenment, being about standing up and turning around, where the mind's eye, metaphorically, the mind's eye stands up and turns around, and instead of paying attention or thinking that the being of things is in the particular essences of these shadows on the wall, which represent material things, turning around and seeing the form of things. So the journey of enlightenment is is eventually actually climbing out of the cave, and we'll get to that. So this has had a big influence, and you know, we will see why it's got to do with the main theme, but it can be considered separate from that. So this is a key source of Plato's positive philosophy. All right. So what I'll do now is just, before we go to any questions at all, I'll just give you a bit of a landscape of the text, or of all the 10 books. And I'll go share the screen again, just so you've got something to look at there. Okay, that's the 10. Yeah, okay. All right. So the Republic is very long, as I said, 10 books. The division into books is not Plato's. It's something arbitrary. It's sometimes arbitrary. It's not always arbitrary. Sometimes the divisions make sense. Some editions suppress these divisions and insert their own sections. As I was saying in the Penguin translation, it's got parts to it. And they are helpful, but then they can confuse people when someone's talking about a part and someone else is talking about a book. So standard pagination is important there. So
Bernie, does everyone divide the text differently? Is that what you're saying? Different translators or publishers will divide it differently?
Well, I know that the Penguin one does. The Lee translation that some of you have got, the one that we bought copies of, it does divide it up in a different way than the books. And I can't really speak for any other translations. I can't think of any others that do such a strong division like that. Okay. Yeah, so anyway, so what are we up to? Yeah, and like the first book is like, and it talked about as a prelude as we come into the second book. And it actually seems like it is a separate early dialogue. And it may have had an early version of it might have been a dialogue, a standalone dialogue. And then the last book is like an appendix, like he's talked about, I think we've talked about Plato or being against poetry in education, against the poets and not wanting to use Republic. We might have referred to that. And so that comes up and it's kind of thrown in and he gives his reasons, but then he comes back to that topic in a kind of an appendix at the end. And also in that you move into a discussion then of immortality of the soul, a bit like the Phaedo, and you get another myth, the myth of and some people are really interested in that. So I've actually talked about the first book and the last book there. Now, in the second book, which we read from in part this time, is the introduction to the very project of the ideal city that is just. And we'll see how that's introduced narrative-wise. In the third book, it's an introduction to the theme of education and with its criticism of this cultural education that is current in Athens at the time. So based on poetry. So this is where we get the aversion to poetry beginning. And then in book 4, it's kind of an aside, a whole aside to psychosocial concerns, to the role of the family and women. Now, we're not going to read from this, but we will discuss this because this was quite revolutionary, Plato's attitude to women in this book. And then 5 and 6 is the beginning of the allegorical section. So from this point on, I think we're going to read fairly continuously. This is really the core. The reading kind of gives you the greatest hits, right? It's what most people are interested in the Republic. So this allegorical section is very important. It's important to me. I think it's really important to understanding Plato in general, and generally speaking, it's very popular. So we get into this higher mystical philosophy that then becomes really important for Neoplatonism. Book 7 gives the allegory of the cave, and then the education program. It goes right into how, in instead of doing this education by reading the poets, we do this mathematics and this dialectic, whatever that means. Okay, and then there's this discussion, and it is kind of a thing in itself, but very important to the topic of imperfect forms of government. And he describes them in terms of a devolution from a kingdom, an ideal kingdom, and then how it degenerates from aristocratic government down to democracy, which is the second lowest, which leads you into tyranny. So very interesting critique of democracy that a lot of people find has resonances in our time. And then book 9 closes the discussion on tyranny, and he spends a lot of time discussing the degeneration of democracy into tyranny. And as I said, the last book is this appendix trying to justify why he's very strongly against having representational art, including poetry, in his Republic. Okay, so yeah, what else do I need to say? The philosophical interest concentrates around that allegorical section, so we'll be focusing on that. Political interest focuses around that devolution of government towards tyranny. The details of the utopia are overshadowed by these interests. Other special interests are, as I said, the women, the section on women, and the myth of right at the end. And if folks are interested in this, I'm going to give my summary, and it's up to you to you know, pipe up and ask for more information about that, or to go in and read it yourself. You know, I recommend that for the sections you're interested in, to go beyond our reading. So that's a summary of the whole book. And yeah, we can discuss the sections that people are interested in beyond what I've chosen. Okay, so before we go into starting our narrative from book 1, has anyone got any questions, comments, or reflections on things so far? Anything at all about that? It's pretty clear. Okay, all right. Okay, well, let's get into the meat of it then. All right, so book 1, the beginning of book 1, here we go, Plato's Republic. Are we ready? So the setting at the beginning is the port city of Athens. Piraeus, help me out, Greeks. Piraeus, outside Athens. So it's that port, and they had, yeah, it's interesting in terms of defenses. They had to build a wall and stuff. Outside Athens, in the house of a wealthy non-citizen. So it's outside the wall. It's in the house of a non-citizen during a festival to a foreign god. So people have found this significant, that there's some sort of attempt to separate the discussion from democratic Athens. So the characters that we have, the main characters that we have in this little play, Socrates leading, all the way Socrates leading. At the beginning, we have this interesting character, Thrasymachus. He's a sophist, and he aggressively challenges Socrates in book 1. Pretty much that's what's going on in book 1. After the first 2 books, Socrates dominates the discussion exposition with 2 other players, Adeimantus and especially Glaucon. Okay, there would be reasons for people to know these characters, especially because they were actually Plato's brothers. Now their role is mostly passive, but at certain key points they do turn the discussion by their interventions. So they do have an important narrative role at certain points. So opening the discussion is where Socrates is playfully dragged off the streets into the house of a rich foreign patriarch, where Socrates comes to ask the patriarch of the house, what is it like to be old? The old man replies that it's not so bad, but he raises a concern as one gets older about these stories of the afterlife, including retribution for any injustice committed during life. This raises the question, what is justice? So the first definition comes up quite fast. Give back everything that you owe. It can't simply be this, because you would not give back a weapon to a friend who had gone mad. Nor is justice about telling the truth, which also came up. Sometimes it's necessary to lie to be good. So there must be a deeper meaning of justice. What is justice? So the second definition that comes up is justice is to do good to one's friend and harm to one's enemies. This is about page 332D. Socrates defends this in his own way by question and answer, which we're familiar with in Euthyphro and things like that. But then Thrasymachus attacks him for feigning ignorance and ironic evasion. So here Plato presents, remember Plato's writing this, some people suspend disbelief. Plato presents in the voice of Thrasymachus a really hard criticism of the Socratic method, just as it has been practiced in his earlier works. In this, the third definition comes up, that justice is the advantage of the stronger. Thrasymachus says that rich and powerful folk set up the dogma of what is just and unjust to suit their interests. Now, I don't know if anyone's done any sociology or any Marxism or anything like that, but this sort of, for me, evokes that kind of bourgeois ideology thing that Marx talks about, where he says the bourgeois have this ideology, this way of thinking about the world, way of thinking about justice that suits their interests. Right? So this seems to be what Thrasymachus is saying, that the powerful people set up the dogma of what is justice to suit their interests. Thrasymachus remains aggressive against Socrates' style, while changing tack to say, it is more profitable to be unjust than to be just. Cheats are winners. The unjust have a better life. Now, Socrates counters this by saying, well, for humans to achieve anything, we need cooperation. Cooperation is required so that and so there must be justice within society. So remember, justice has this more of an emphasis towards the individual at the time. Justice provides the possibility to achieve the common good together. Achieving the common good achieves good for all in a way that you can't do it if you don't have that cooperation. Okay, so we're moving towards the social. And there's a discussion in terms of systems. So in terms of, and the analogy between, and this will come up again and again, the analogy between the system of the body and the system of society. Systems work well if their parts do their job properly. It's like the human body. If every part has a function, and if every part does its function well, then the whole body prospers. The function, purpose of the psyche, the soul, is to live well, which means to live justly within oneself. Thrasymachus reluctantly concedes in the debate that to Socrates, So Socrates does the Socratic method. He manages to, you know, outplay Thrasymachus, if you like, and has a technical win. And this concludes the first book. But the thing is, no, it could be the end, but the thing is that not everyone is convinced. Moreover, the question of what is justice hasn't been answered. That question actually hasn't been answered yet. This is the pretext to continue beyond what is then called the prelude. And that leads us into book 2. So there's quite a bit there. And so I will just pause there and have a little sip of tea. And if anyone's got anything, any reflections on that, pipe up. Okay, we'll keep going. All right. So that's that book that's kind of looks like it's a dialogue on its own, and it finishes inconclusively, just like Euthyphro did. Remember? So Glaucon says that they're not convinced by Socrates' case, and they want him to make a stronger case against a restating of Thrasymachus's case. So he wants to play the devil's advocate, if you like. Glaucon sets out to make a sophistic style rhetorical speech about justice, injustice, as value in itself, not in terms of its consequences. That is, what if you were just, but appeared unjust? What if you got none of the benefits of justice, like social esteem for being a fine, upstanding person, because you appear the opposite, an unjust person, but were actually a just person? So what if you were just and didn't get all the social accolades for being so? In appearing trustworthy and all that sort of thing, would it be good for you still to be just even when you appeared to be unjust? Or is it vice versa, that it's better to be unjust and appear to be just? What if you had a reputation for justice, but underneath you're a sly snake and you were unjust? This is what Glaucon argues for. And it introduces a theme in Plato of appearance and reality and the difference between the two. And we can think of corrupt religious leaders, you know, this sort of thing. They're probably the easiest thing to think about when we think of someone in that situation. Okay, so this sets up the stage for the remainder of the Republic. And so Socrates has to show that justice has some intrinsic value, not just some consequential value. This marks the end of the introductory discursive contestation and begins the constructive building of the Republic. So remember, justice, dikos, has a broader meaning and could refer to a healthy harmony in a person, but the promise, like the promise of, say, practice of like yoga or something, or personal righteousness. To explain what is just in the individual, Socrates wants to first show it writ large in the city. In this way, he will show us that it is in itself, show us what it is in itself, you know, whether it's in the individual or in society. This is a sociological argument he's going to use. And this brings in the opportunity to build his hypothetical state, his utopia. A state comes to being in theory, as he says, to build a theoretical state from scratch. So, and so this is coming into your reading now. The building begins with simple demarcation of responsibilities by division of labor or craft. And there's a big emphasis on specialization. Specialization is the key. Every citizen has their role according to their aptitude and sticks to it and leaves others alone. The effect of the specialization is a strong mutual dependence. It kind of forces people in a way to depend on everyone else. And so that helps people work towards the mutual goal, collective goal. And so it supports the necessity of cooperation to bring about justice. Here he introduces a professional army. So that's required. And for the first time, we get this term guardian. Okay, so as we go on through the reading, the term guardian, the class of people called guardians, becomes really important. The guardians of the state, first mentioned just on page 375E. They'll be important for the rest of the dialogue, especially the way we educate them. There was this whole section on the way you need to educate these guardians. They defend the state externally, so militarily, and internally through government. Selection of these rulers is important as they need to be gentle, yet high-spirited, but also passionate about knowledge and wisdom. This balance of attributes is hard to find, especially because, like soldier types, imagine in our society, people who are the soldier types in our society, and philosophy types, you usually don't get both together. So you need to carefully select, but also their education is important. Their education from when they're very young, right through. So this raises the question, how do we educate them? So I think that brings us to the end of the first reading. I will pause again and ask if anyone has any queries about that. Then I'll talk about the section in between before we get to this discussion of the soul, which is the second part of the reading. So any questions or queries or reflections on that section?
I'd like to raise the issue of the specialisation because you can see how it's required in building the state, depending on how big that state is, and the importance of an individual's abilities matched to what they're doing, what work they're doing in life. But there has to be a balance, I think, in where the dependence is, because that can be quite a vulnerability for that state. If there's only one specialist, then that can be quite vulnerable. Things will break down.
If there's only one
I think
specialist,
he talks, yeah, in one area. Like he starts
but
off
what
very
if,
small.
What if there's a lot of shoemakers?
Yeah,
and there's a lot of,
that's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
Yeah. So is it a bit like our society? I mean, isn't our society like that to the extreme? You know,
Yeah, it is.
We have enormous specialization, don't we?
But it's actually a really good argument from what you said about having that strong mutual dependence, working towards a mutual goal, because that binds people and binds the unit and the state and gives a sense of worth or purpose to individuals. I think there are lots of different layers there that are important.
Right. Okay. It's like the opposite to every person for themselves. Everyone's got to come together, and we're forced to come together because I don't know how to make a shoe. You know, I don't know how to make a wheel for my cart and that sort of thing. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Anyone else?
what is the mutual goal and who decides it?
What is the actual goal and who decides it? The goal is a good society and a just society.
That's
Yeah.
a great question, Vorlo. That's a fantastic question, because you're asking it about us, I suppose, and everywhere, aren't you? And you can.
You'd have to be a bit more concrete than a good and just society. What does that mean, wouldn't it?
Well, this is really what the dialogue is about. And we may not like the answer, but yeah, that is the question. I mean, and that is what's being raised at this point. It's worked through again and again as we move on. But you know, like he's got to kind of work out, well, the next bit that we read is about, well, what is the makeup of the individuals within the society, the individual psyches, and how do we, because society is made up of the individuals, how do we work in harmony with this, between the psyche and the social, that sort of thing. And so, and then what is our goal in what is justice, what is good? So yeah.
But we also have a I think in modern society, the other element that we would inject into it is freedom. So, because I guess what I'm sort of struggling with is this sort of, or wondering about is the way in which, you know, there's almost a pigeonholing, I guess, of individuals into particular, existences that they're being asked to spend their life pursuing, that, you know, continual specialisation. But there's no, I didn't come across a discussion of the freedom of the individual to pursue, like a particular interest that they might develop, you know, as they live their life and gain more life experience, for instance. Is there because we're talking about a traditional Hellenic society here.
Yeah, this is a common reflection on the text, Nick, that you're picking up already. Yeah, so coming from our perspective, and you know, might I say also that 2,400 years ago, Plato didn't experience totalitarianism the way we experienced it last century. You know, there were amazing experiences in the history of European, if I can say that, culture that he doesn't really have to draw on. He has the Spartans to draw on. He has various other things to draw on, and of course the Spartans defeated the Athenian coalition, and in Plato's lifetime, and the Spartans were a very militaristic society. So yes, there is some stuff here, and as we go on, there'll be more that offends our liberal sensibilities in terms of the freedom of the individual, certainly. Yeah, anyone else?
Yeah, I just want to ask, is there, in the categories, the 5 categories, is there a hierarchy within that, like a class system?
Oh yeah, yes, definitely is, and we'll get to that. We'll get to that shortly. In fact, I think we get to that today. The gold, silver, and bronze people. That's today, I think.
Oh,
yeah. So we can talk about that in a minute. There certainly is a hierarchy, and the hierarchy within the ideal harmonious hierarchy within the soul is, and the conclusion of today is reflected in the hierarchy in the society and the different responsibilities and traits of the different parts of society. So yes, definitely the guardians are in power. Yes.
And the poor slaves are just appendages. They don't get a good
Well, he's not big on slaves, although sometimes they get mentioned. I think it's really the artisans, if you like. So there's the tradies. So the main categories are tradies. So they're the ordinary people. And then guardians gets divided up a bit. So there's the kind of like the senior as in older actually guardians who are more into the leading and being the sources of wisdom and giving advice on how to run society and keeping tabs on it. And then there's the younger perhaps military auxiliaries, guardian auxiliaries to the government. So they're the more military ones. So there's just these three main categories, and they're quite a minority, those ones. Most people are just tradies, doing their job. Ordinary society.
Is the term philosopher kings, is that from Plato?
That's correct. That's correct, yeah. Yep. So it comes up in a couple of ways. I won't anticipate it too much, but you have this class of rulers, the guardians. But then he talks about, it got to a point, well, this is just a fantasy and could it really be implemented? And then he talks about, well, if somehow you could get someone in a position who was an educated philosopher who then became a king. So that would be your philosopher king. But that's right. Philosopher king is where this comes from, and rightly, it's not really too much of an abuse. Yeah.
Bernie, I'm just wondering, listening to everyone speak and raise objections about the freedom of the individual, which is something that is pretty valuable today. It seems like society today is organized with that end in mind, or at least a little bit. And I'm wondering, is that the case with Plato? It sounds like it's not. And if it's not, then to what end does he want this republic?
Okay, well, so the first thing today is really to reflect historically. Sorry, the first thing is to reflect historically on our current situation. So modern individualism, modern liberalism is a very recent phenomena that is extraordinary in the history of civilizations. It is, it's outstanding. So we are in a position where the freedom of the individual that we expect, liberalism, the whole philosophy of liberalism that's grown up over the last 300 years is extraordinary. So we're coming from our point of view with that. We find it difficult to understand a position where the rights of the individuals are subordinated to the good of the individuals, subordinated to the good of society. And so there are societies today where that, and in the last century, where that's happened. Some, horrors from our point of view, totalitarian states, but even like a comparison is interesting, say between perhaps the US, maybe the UK as well, and the Nordic countries, Sweden. I really find that with the Swedish attitude, where Swedish people that I know accept subordination of individual freedoms for the common good. So in terms of like what alcohol they can buy, for example, you have to buy it through the state. And we just go, oh, that's outrageous. And they go, oh, no, well, it's good for this and it's good for that. So it varies today. And some of where we don't have that individualism, they're horror stories, so like the Soviet Union under Stalin and Maoism and, in the worst period, and Hitler, of course. So,
They were subordinating individual freedom of everyone to individual freedom of some smaller number of people. Is that the case with Plato, or was it subordinated to some ideal?
Well, that's how you read it, David.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know whether a Nazi would read it that way.
What would they say?
Well, they were serving the Reich. And some of them had miserable times serving the Reich too, didn't they?
I wonder what is the Reich serving, or what is the Republic serving? Or is that the end in itself?
Well, the Republic is creating a just societies where everyone will be happy. So I suppose the argument's a bit like this. If we all try to pursue our individual freedoms, right? Our individual justice, like, you know, justice as in harmony within ourselves and being happy and everything. If we all try to pursue it individually, then we're all going to be miserable, to take the extreme, right? We're all going to be miserable because we're all going to fail, because we're all going to be fighting each other and blah, blah, blah. But if we pursue it together, then potentially we can all be just in ourselves. So, you know, like, you know, like what yoga promises or whatever, harmony within ourselves, and happy, and the society is happy and harmonious. So the society allows the individual to be happy. And this happens with the education as well, where, well, you can't have a good and just person in our society because our society rewards, you know, bad behavior. So that's why you have to reconstruct the society so that it rewards good behavior. And then justice prospers on the macro level and the micro level within the individual and within society. That's the argument.
So it's subordinating freedom for justice, individual freedom for individual justice, or
definitely,
justice.
Definitely, yeah. And so that is the contrast, if you like, between, you know, and I don't want to use caricatures here too much, but really it's probably helpful, don't overstate it, to compare Sweden to America. Okay, so America's really strong on individual freedom and libertarianism, liberty, you know, to do certain things. I won't mention guns, but individual freedom, and then Sweden, the people say, no, we're going to give up our individual freedoms for the good of all. Yeah. So, and that's where Plato's pushing it against a society, by the way, which was very strong on individual freedoms in the ancient world. Yeah, in Athens, compared to Sparta. So some people say, actually, I should stop soon. Some people say that that in many ways, as we go on, that Plato was modeling certainly the life of the guardians on Spartan society. So Spartan society was very militaristic and very harsh, and you know, like the men people lived, especially the men lived in barracks, you know, quite harsh. You know, there wasn't you know, there wasn't a valuing of softness and luxury in Sparta. That's where we get that expression, you know, he's very Spartan, she's very Spartan. Okay, yeah, anyone else before we go on? All right, we probably should go on. Okay, so now between the readings, so you guys read that first bit, and then there's this, so he said that education is important. Remember, he said selection's important. So, you know, like, you know, how do we get people that are good soldiers as well as good philosophers? You know, it's hard to get, selection's important, but if we educate them well, then that's important. And education is important, especially for the guardians, and that remains a thing. So he starts talking firstly about physical education, and it's important. So, in Greek and Athenian society, there was a very strong push for physical education and cultural education. It's two different areas, so phys ed and cultural ed. And it's Kathy, pick up your ears, yeah. Yeah, the traditional education, there was the gym, the boys exercising naked. It was very ritualized, and there's anointing with oil afterwards. And there's kind of this warrior culture around it, and generally around, you know, you might be from a wealthy family, but, you know, you needed to be brave in warfare. You needed to be a warrior. And so that warrior type thing also pushed on, as in our society, for Olympic champions. So physical, physical triumphs at the Olympic Games, where these people were lauded as heroes for the rest of their lives in those days, as maybe in our days as well. And then they had the traditional education, had the cultural education, emphasis on learning the great poems, learning Homer and Hesiod. Hesios, I should say in Greek, I think. The broad poetry is music, and is considered to be music, and it is musical. It wasn't always done to music, but it was musical in that it rhymed. And indeed, we call our arts or culture education, what we call arts or culture education was kind of considered musical education. So there's a bit of a translation thing there, but it's also the importance of music and the way music was seen to be, music and poetry was seen to be, have this very broad scope. And so that came with real emphasis on Homer, especially. So this is not about or Smithy or whatever. This is the education above all that, especially amongst the elites. So Plato rejected this education via the reciting of the poets, a cultural education, for a number of reasons, and not just here. Also, and more strongly so, he returns to it in this kind of appendix in book 10, right at the end. And elsewhere in the dialogues, it comes up. And so I'll just briefly give the main reasons for rejecting the poetic education. And it's to do with promoting false stories about the gods, and that models bad behavior. So the impressionable youth should not be told all these wild, violent stories of the immoral behavior of the gods, their anger, their despair, because firstly, it sets a bad example, bad role models, and secondly, because the stories are not true. So when he says this is quite controversial, and think about it in terms of Socrates as well and what he was accused of. These stories, the stories of the gods are false. If they are even allegorically true, then the youth may not pick this deeper meaning and be misled. And then there's the horror stories of the afterlife, increases fear of death, and the mitigation of bravery in war. If you're scared to die anyway, and then you hear these horror stories of the afterlife, you're even more scared to die. He criticizes the imitative arts, the arts like acting and poems that tell stories, you know, fiction basically. And he says that you become like the people you imitate. And, you know, here we are reading a dialogue, which is a play, a fiction, you know, so isn't there some implicit self-contradiction here? I'll leave that one with you. So the gods should not be portrayed as committing falsehoods. Falsehood in psyche and in words is a distinction that Socrates makes here. So Socrates distinguishes falsehood in false stories are permitted, e.g. to protect against enemies and to protect friends against themselves. So you're allowed to tell a lie so long as it's good, you know, it's to a good outcome. And so falsehoods, so it's okay then, he extends this to to tell legends that are false just so long as they give a good outcome. So, and we can remember that it goes on a bit later. He talks about a noble lie, and this is about the classes of society into bronze, silver, gold, silver, and bronze people. That's his noble lie. So it's okay, propaganda. You know, we know stories like this. You know, Biggles in England, or the propaganda of the Soviet Union, or Maoist, or Hitler, or whatever. You know, it's okay to tell a lie so long as it's to a good outcome. And we'll remember, I called it the lullaby for the dying, right at the end of the Phaedo, where, you know, Socrates says, well, this may not be true, but it has a good outcome because you don't lament me, and I go to death happy, knowing that I'm going to be up there, you know, enjoying heaven with all these great people. So, so lying is actually okay. So, but with this propaganda, the gods are good. So the propaganda has to portray the gods as good. The gods should be portrayed in a good light as absolute goodness. So poetry needs to be written. So there can be poetry, but it needs to be written as uplifting stories. So this education by poets the education by the poets, by Homer and Hesiod and so forth, will be replaced in a big part, apart from this propaganda, will be replaced in a big part by science, the mathematical sciences, and we'll get to them in, I think, about week 3, and dialectics. So, and then at the end of this section, he talks about this great noble lie. He then goes into it where there's gold, silver, and bronze people. And the story is that people are produced from the earth, and some are mostly gold, some are mostly silver, some are mostly bronze. The predominance of the metal determines your role in the city. This is a class society. Generally speaking, gold parents will produce gold children, and so on. Although he says sometimes a gold child will be born to a bronze, and then they will be brought up into the gold. So in book 4, he starts talking about more about the guardians, how they'll live in barracks, and it looks very much Spartan influenced here. And he raises the question, and then the question is raised, which is we were discussing with, but what if the guardians aren't happy? Why should they not be? Why should they not get the benefits of power? Which usually happens when you're powerful, when you're a ruler, you get the benefits like a king. And Socrates answers, the aim is not happiness for the guardians, but the good of the whole. So he's making the sociological argument, which we've already discussed. And I need to move on. So then we move into this discussion of the virtues of a good society. What is justice and injustice in society? What makes a society happy? So we're returning again to that Fuller. And he introduces these traditional cardinal virtues: wisdom, courage, discipline or temperance, it's translated differently, and justice. And I'll briefly summarize what he means by this. So wisdom needs to be awakened, and this is the aim of the education. The overriding emphasis in the Republic is on teaching the guardian rulers so that they attain wisdom. Courage is about judgment about danger. It's a retentiveness like a good dye in cloth. If it's strong, it can't be washed away by pleasure, fear, or desire. Courage is like a dye. It's strong and doesn't go away. This is what the military auxiliary, so remember he starts dividing between the guardians and the guardian military. So they need courage. And then the second last one is temperance or discipline. This is, in the first place, a mastery of desire and appetite. So it's a It's a fitting together, a unity of a unity of the society's best, that is wisdom, and worst, lowly desire. It has to be brought into harmony. The desires have to be controlled. So society has to master itself. That's what temperance or discipline means. It kind of makes sense. And then finally it comes to justice. This is to do the job you are naturally suited to and mind your own business. Justice makes the other three possible. So we're now getting a definition of justice. Interference of the three classes and the people not doing their job and interfering, that's injustice. So there we have it. What is justice? We have this answer. It's specialization, and then in your specialization, doing it well and minding your own business. So we can discuss that. And the final thing that I need to do today, and I'm aware that we're pushing the time a bit, is with the second reading, is this tripartite soul. Now, he's moving from the macro, he's been talking about society, and then he goes back to the psyche again, right? So it's a return to a comparison of the just individual and just the social justice. Remember, society is the personal writ large. So he's using that analogy and he's moving between the two. By placing this social justice beside psychic justice. So the form of state justice emerges from justice within the person. This is where he comes to the structure, this structure of the soul. So Plato sets up an analogy between justice in social and in the person. So we get this three parts of the soul, and I might put that up on the screen now, so we can share that screen. Okay, so the three parts, and this, he comes back to this in the Phaedrus actually, if people have done, who read the Phaedrus in Platonic love. So there's reason, there's desire, appetite, so those kind of base base appetites and desires, and then there's spirit, anger, indignation. People find it really hard to translate this. The Greek word is thumos. Okay, so what does he mean by that? Some people call it the heart soul in a more literal translation. It's like desire, but can act in opposition to it. For Plato, it should be enlisted by reason to control desire. So if you like, when you have a desire, right, a base desire, whether it's a sexual desire or appetite or whatever, and then something in your soul comes up to control it, that's what this is. That's what this spirit is, or this heart soul is. Yeah, its motive is not for the object, but for changing it. So this is where we get the alignment. We've got reason in the soul, which is aligned with the virtue of wisdom, which is what the rulers need, the guardians need. Spirit, thumos, is aligned with courage, and the auxiliaries, the military auxiliaries need a lot of that. And then the lowly desires, well, they're prevalent in the citizenry, and they need to be controlled. So what about discipline and justice in the psyche? Well, this is all about reason using spirit to control the lowly desires. Justice in the psyche is when all the parts work together and mind their own business. So the healthy state of the soul is in balance. Every part is minding its own business and doing its job, and in harmony and in health. Okay, so there we have it. So the social and the personal are aligned. Reason, wisdom is in charge. Spirit, courage serves reason, wisdom, and keeps the lowly passions and desires under control. This is Plato's ideal. What do you think of that? So There we go. So that was I went into the second reading today, and there's that tripartite division of the soul, and lots of stuff there. So I'm sorry if I rushed that a bit. So yeah, any comments or reflections on that?
So how did so again, looking at it from our modern position, justice seems to mean something quite different to us than it did to you know, the Athenians. So what was Plato's idea of justice, was that generally accepted by the population at the time? You know, because it does seem, this idea of basically do your job and don't interfere is something that a totalitarian society would value quite highly.
Yeah, that's right. And now we do have to draw the distinction between what Plato is pushing here, which in every way has the sense of being quite radical, right? So, and comparing that to what was the norm in society. And I think the norm in society then was fairly close to, in terms of social justice, our idea of social justice. And that was mediated through the courts and through the Senate, through legislation and that sort of thing. There was an idea that you had to be, if you like, fair to everyone and let everyone have their go. But of course, it was a class society as well in terms of, you know, traditional roles, women and men, and then there were the wealthy, and the wealthy did push their way. But there was a sense of justice there that is closer to ours. This is quite radical. Mind your own business. Just do your job. Yeah.
And what keeps bothering me is this notion that something might appear just, but in fact have an undercurrent of injustice, and therefore powerful. The powerful in a society might be underhandedly keeping the lower classes, if you like, in their place.
Yeah, and this is kind of like where Plato should apply his own self-criticism. I mean, the situation for us, of course, is when we look at what happened in the 20th century, well, what happens when you set something up like this and then it gets abused? You know, the power at the top gets abused. And, you know, you can think of the Soviets. You know, it was, you know, you had the Soviets, and they were, you know, and you had secretaries, not kings, but you were the secretary of the Soviet. You were just the secretary, but you weren't, you know, after a while you weren't. So yeah, you can see how perhaps this could easily be abused, and we have examples of the way this sort of approach was abused, where people were putting in the philosophy of Marx, applying that to society, and then that was their pretense, if you like, however you want to say it, and then it was then abused.
So was this sort of a response to something that Plato was seeing within the Athenian society? That, so, because as you said, there was a court system, there was a Senate, you know, there was in Socrates' trial, he had to convince a majority of people as to his innocence. So there is some potential for checks and balances, let's say, in that society. What was it? Because this does, as you say, is quite radical in some of the ideas that he's putting forward. And was it a reaction to, or a criticism, let's say, of the way in which Plato saw society progressing, moving?
So just quickly, our society, you know, our system of justice, social justice, is modelled on theirs, very much modelled on theirs, you know, with the the legislation thing and the courts setting precedent and all that sort of thing. It's very much modeled on what they had in Plato's time. So that's an important thing to say. And we have not followed Plato, what he suggested as an alternative. I guess there's two other things to say. Well, these societies were unstable, and tyrants quickly took power. And tyrant wasn't necessarily a bad term, but Plato made it a bad term. He thought tyranny was the worst. And they'd had the 30 tyrants in his childhood after the defeat by Sparta. Societies were always fighting each other. There was, I suppose, as in our time now, there's a sense in which we've got to do this better. Now, the other way we've got to do it better is his philosophy, his notion of enlightenment. He wanted people who were enlightened to run the society. That's what we'll get to in the following weeks. If people don't mind going over, I can take another couple of questions and then we can wind up. Anything else? Okay, well, look, what we'll do is I'll stay, as I do with the other classes, I'll just stay here and wind it up and say goodbye. And if anyone's got anything else as they're leaving the room, so to speak, then we can chat then. But so next week, so we've introduced, we changed the reading this week so that you would see that actual introduction of the, of where he says, okay, let's build this society. We need a tinker tailor, we need this, we need that. Next week, he builds up from this to this attention to the education of the philosopher. What is the true philosopher? The seeker of reality. Well, what is reality? And then we get into the theory of the forms. Then we get into the philosophy. So we're going to start delving deep into the philosophy from next week. So we return to the theory of forms and the orientation of the philosopher towards them, how we do this through education. So that'll be next week's reading. Thank you everyone for coming. And we'll see you at the same time on the same link next week. So thanks for coming and stick around if you want to have a bit more of a chat. Okay.
Thank you. It was fascinating. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.